Margaret Fletcher pressed herself against the cold wall of the parlor, trying to become invisible as another potential suitor walked through their front door. She had done this dance so many times before that she could predict every step. First, her father would put on his biggest smile and welcome the man like an old friend. Then her mother would appear with her finest tea set, the one they only used for special occasions. And finally, whichever sister was being presented that day would glide down the stairs in her best dress, looking like a princess from a fairy tale. Today it was Helena's turn. Her youngest sister had just turned 17, and already 3 men had asked for her hand in marriage. Helena was everything Margaret wasn't. She had golden hair that caught the sunlight streaming through the windows, bright blue eyes that sparkled when she laughed, and a smile that could make any man forget his own name. When Helena entered the room, even Margaret had to admit she looked breathtaking in her pale pink dress. The suitor, a well-dressed merchant from the next town over, practically stumbled over his own feet when he saw Helena. Margaret watched from her corner as he tried to impress her sister with stories of his successful business and his grand house with servants. Helena giggled at all the right moments and blushed when he complimented her beauty. It was a performance Margaret had witnessed 4 times before with her other sisters. Margaret remembered when Rebecca, her oldest sister, had gotten married 3 years ago. The whole town had talked about what a perfect match it was. Rebecca was beautiful and charming, and her husband was wealthy and respected. The wedding had been the social event of the year. Then came Catherine, who married a banker from the city. Then Louise, who caught the eye of a lawyer's son. And now Helena would soon follow the same path. But Margaret? She was 19 years old and had never even been introduced to a potential husband. While her sisters were being courted and married off, she spent her days helping with household chores, tending to her mother's garden, and reading books in the attic when no one was looking. Her father had made it clear that books were a waste of time for a woman, but Margaret couldn't help herself. Stories took her away from her reality, even if just for a little while. The truth was painful, but simple. Margaret wasn't pretty like her sisters. Her hair was a plain brown color that never seemed to catch the light quite right. Her eyes were a muddy green that people often forgot about moments after meeting her. She was too tall, too thin, and too quiet. While her sisters learned to flutter their eyelashes and giggle sweetly, Margaret preferred to listen and observe. While they practiced piano and embroidery, she helped her mother with cooking and cleaning because someone had to do the real work. Her father, Robert Fletcher, had never hidden his disappointment in his youngest daughter. He was a merchant who struggled to keep his business afloat, and he saw his daughters as his ticket to financial security. Each marriage brought a dowry payment that helped keep the family out of poverty, but Margaret? She was what he called his bad investment. He had spent money feeding her, clothing her, and keeping her under his roof for 19 years, and he had nothing to show for it. "Look at her," Margaret had overheard him telling her mother just last week. "She's past marriageable age and getting older every day. No man wants a wife who's too smart for her own good and too plain to look at. I've got half a mind to send her to work for her aunt in the city. At least then she'd earn her keep as a seamstress or a maid." Her mother, Patricia, had once been Margaret's defender. When Margaret was younger, her mother would brush her hair gently and tell her that inner beauty was more important than outer beauty. But as the years passed and Margaret remained unmarried while her sisters found husbands, even her mother's patience wore thin. Now Patricia barely looked at Margaret during family gatherings, focusing all her attention on whichever daughter was currently being courted. The worst part wasn't even her family's treatment of her. It was how the whole town saw her. When she walked to the market, she could hear the whispers behind her back. "There goes the Fletcher girl who couldn't find a husband. Poor thing, she must be so jealous of her pretty sisters. I heard her father is getting desperate to marry her off to anyone who'll take her." The local women would shake their heads in pity, while the men didn't even bother to look in her direction. Margaret had learned to keep her head down and her thoughts to herself. She had tried to make herself useful around the house, hoping that if she couldn't be beautiful, at least she could be valuable. She kept the household accounts because she was good with numbers. She tended the vegetable garden because she had a gentle touch with plants. She mended clothes and darned socks because her needlework was precise and careful. But none of these skills seemed to matter when it came to finding a husband. Sometimes, late at night when everyone else was asleep, Margaret would stand in front of the small mirror in her room and try to see what others saw. She would practice smiling the way Helena did, or try to arrange her hair like Rebecca used to wear hers. But no matter what she did, she still saw the same plain face looking back at her. She wasn't ugly exactly, but she wasn't pretty either. She was just ordinary, and in a world where a woman's beauty determined her worth. Ordinary wasn't enough. The conversation in the parlor was reaching its conclusion. Margaret could tell because Helena's laugh was getting higher and more musical, which meant she was pleased with the attention. Her father's voice was getting louder and more boastful, which meant he smelled a good deal. And her mother was talking about wedding preparations, which meant another sister would soon be leaving home. Within the hour, Helena's engagement would be announced. There would be celebrations and congratulations. Neighbors would come by to offer their good wishes and admire Helena's ring. The house would be filled with the excitement of planning another wedding, and Margaret would fade further into the background, becoming even more invisible than she already was. As the merchant shook hands with her father and promised to return the next day with a formal proposal, Margaret quietly slipped out of the parlor and climbed the stairs to her small room under the eaves. She sat on her narrow bed and looked out the tiny window at the world beyond. Somewhere out there, her sisters were living their new lives as wives and mothers. They had beautiful homes and loving husbands who cherished them. They had purpose and respect and happiness, and here she was, still in the same house where she had grown up, still wearing the same plain dresses she had worn for years, still wondering if anyone would ever want her. Her father was running out of patience, and she knew it was only a matter of time before he would accept any offer for her hand, no matter how unsuitable the man might be. She had heard him say that even a poor farmer or an old widower would be better than having her around. The house forever. Margaret pulled her worn copy of poetry from under her mattress and held it close to her chest. Tomorrow would bring another day of being invisible, another day of watching life happen to everyone else but her. But tonight she could dream about a different kind of life, where someone might see past her plain appearance and value the person she was inside. 6 months had passed since Helena's wedding, and the Fletcher house felt emptier than ever. Margaret had watched her last sister dance away in a carriage decorated with white ribbons, leaving behind only the echo of laughter and the lingering scent of wedding flowers. Now it was just Margaret, her parents, and the uncomfortable silence that filled the rooms where her sisters' voices used to ring out. Her father had grown more irritable with each passing day. Without the excitement of wedding preparations or the promise of dowry payments, Robert Fletcher found himself staring at his biggest problem: what to do with Margaret. She had turned 20 just last month, and in their small town that made her practically an old maid. The whispers had grown louder, and the pitying looks had become more obvious. Even the local pastor had started making pointed comments during Sunday sermons about how every woman had a purpose in God's plan. Margaret spent her mornings tending to the house and her afternoons helping her mother with the endless chores that came with running a household. But she could feel the tension building like storm clouds on the horizon. Her father would pace the parlor in the evenings, muttering about expenses and responsibilities. Her mother would sigh heavily whenever she looked at Margaret, as if her very presence was a reminder of their failure as parents. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when Mrs. Henderson from next door made another one of her helpful visits. She sat in the parlor sipping tea and making conversation that was anything but innocent. "I saw the most interesting thing in town yesterday," Mrs. Henderson said, her eyes gleaming with the kind of excitement that came from sharing gossip. Young Billy Thompson was asking about available girls in the area. "You know Billy, don't you? The one who works at the grain mill? Poor boy lost his wife in childbirth last winter, and now he's got 3 little ones to care for." Margaret's mother merely choked on her tea. Billy Thompson was at least 15 years older than Margaret, had a reputation for drinking too much, and lived in a cramped house behind the mill that always smelled of grain dust and sadness. Of course, Mrs. Henderson continued, pretending not to notice the horrified look on Patricia Fletcher's face. He's not looking for a young, pretty wife anymore. He just needs someone who can cook and clean and help with the children. Someone practical, you might say? The message was clear. Margaret was exactly the kind of practical, desperate choice that a man like Billy Thompson might consider. After Mrs. Henderson left, Margaret's parents had their first real conversation about her future in months. "We can't be picky anymore," her father said bluntly. "She's 20 years old, Patricia." 20. Do you know what people are saying about us? About her? We've got to accept that she's not going to marry well. We need to find anyone who'll take her. Margaret listened. From the kitchen where she was washing dishes, her hands trembling as she scrubbed the same plate over and over again. This was her life they were discussing like she was a piece of furniture they needed to get rid of 3 weeks later. Everything changed with a knock on their front door. Margaret answered it to find a man unlike any of the suitors who had visited. For her sisters. He was tall but not imposing, with brown hair that looked like he had been working outdoors and clothes that were clean, but clearly made for function rather than fashion. His face was weathered by sun and wind, and his hands showed the calluses of honest work. When he removed his hat and introduced himself as Thomas Whitmore, his voice was quiet but steady. "I'm looking for Robert Fletcher," he said politely. "I believe we have some mutual friends who thought we might have business to discuss." Margaret called for her father, who appeared with the eager smile he always wore when money might be involved. But this time was different. Thomas Whitmore wasn't here to be impressed by fine tea sets or flowery conversation. He got straight to the point. "I'm a rancher from about 50 miles west of here," Thomas explained as they settled in the parlor. "I've got a good spread of land, healthy cattle, and a house that needs a woman's touch. My mother lives with me, but she's getting on in years and needs help. I'm looking for a wife who's practical and hardworking, someone who can be a real partner in building something meaningful." Margaret's father practically rubbed his hands together with excitement. This was exactly the kind of opportunity he had been hoping for. A rancher with land and cattle was a respectable match, even if he wasn't wealthy. "My daughter Margaret is exactly what you're looking for," Robert Fletcher said, gesturing toward Margaret, who was serving refreshments. "She's been running this household practically single-handed. She's smart with numbers, good with cooking and cleaning, and she's never given us a moment's trouble." Thomas turned to look at Margaret properly for the first time since entering the house. She expected to see the usual flicker of disappointment that crossed men's faces when they realized she was the daughter being offered. Instead, his gaze was thoughtful and measuring, like he was trying to understand something important. "Can you read and write?" Thomas asked Margaret directly, surprising everyone in the room. "Yes, sir," Margaret replied quietly. "I keep the household accounts and help with correspondence." "Good," Thomas nodded. "Ranch life requires someone who can handle business matters when I'm away with the cattle. What about horses? Are you comfortable around them?" Margaret's father started to answer for her, but Thomas held up a gentle hand. "I'd like to hear from her, if you don't mind." "I've never worked with horses regularly," Margaret admitted, "but I'm not afraid of animals. I help care for our neighbors' chickens and goats when they travel." Something in Thomas's expression softened slightly. "That's honest. I appreciate honesty." The conversation continued for another hour, but it felt different from every other negotiation Margaret had witnessed. Thomas asked practical questions about her skills and interests. He wanted to know if she could handle the isolation of ranch life, if she was willing to learn new tasks, and if she understood that ranch work was demanding and sometimes dangerous. He also told her about his life without trying to impress anyone. His ranch was successful but modest. He had been married before, but his wife had died 3 years ago from a fever, and they had never had children. His mother, Eleanor, was a sweet woman who would welcome help and companionship. The nearest town was small but friendly, and there was a church and a school for future children. "I won't lie to you," Thomas said, looking directly at Margaret. Ranch life is hard work. The weather can be brutal, and there are times when it's just you and the land for miles around. But it's also peaceful and rewarding. You'd be building something real, something lasting. Margaret found herself speaking up, surprising herself with her boldness. What happened to your first wife, if you don't mind me asking? Thomas didn't seem offended by the question. Ruth was a good woman, but she never really took to ranch life. She missed the city and her family. When she got sick, the nearest doctor was too far away. His voice grew quieter. I learned that a ranch needs someone who wants to be there, someone who sees it as home rather than exile. The business side of the arrangement was settled quickly. Thomas would provide a modest bride price, enough to help Robert Fletcher pay off some of his debts. Margaret would come to the ranch as his wife within a month, giving her time to prepare for the move. It wasn't a romantic courtship, but it was respectful and straightforward. After Thomas left, Margaret's parents were practically glowing with relief. Their problem daughter finally had a solution. Margaret herself felt a confusing mix of emotions. She was grateful to escape the increasing desperation of her situation, but terrified of the unknown life ahead of her. At least Thomas seemed kind and honest, which was more than she had dared to hope for. That night, as she packed her few belongings, Margaret wondered if this was how all her sisters had felt before their weddings. The difference was that they had been marrying for love and status. She was marrying for survival and the chance at a different kind of life. Only time would tell if that would be enough. The wagon ride to Thomas's ranch took most of the day, and with every mile that passed, Margaret felt like she was traveling to a different world. She sat beside her new husband on the wooden seat, her small trunk of belongings secured in the back along with supplies from town. Thomas wasn't much of a talker, but his silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. He pointed out landmarks along the way and shared practical information about the area, like which creek had the sweetest water and where the wild berries grew. Best in summer. As they traveled further from civilization, the landscape began to change. The cramped houses and busy streets of town gave way to rolling hills, covered in tall grass that moved like ocean waves in the wind. Margaret had never seen so much open space in her life. Back home, every inch of land was claimed and cultivated. Here, the sky seemed to stretch on forever, painted in shades of blue she hadn't known existed. It's beautiful, she said quietly. Almost to herself, Thomas glanced at her with something that might have been surprise. Most people find it too empty out here, too quiet. I've never had much quiet in my life, Margaret replied honestly. This feels peaceful. When they finally reached the ranch, Margaret's first impression was of a place that had been built with care and purpose. The house wasn't grand, but it was solid and welcoming, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and flowers growing in neat beds alongside the walkway. The barn and outbuildings looked well maintained, and she could see cattle grazing in the distance, dark dots against the green pasture. Before they had even stopped the wagon, the front door opened and a small elderly woman stepped onto the porch. This had to be Eleanor Thomas's mother. Margaret had been nervous about meeting her, wondering if she would be cold or judgmental like so many of the older women back home. Instead, Eleanor's face lit up with genuine warmth when she saw them approaching. Thomas? She called out, her voice carrying easily across the yard. You're back safe? Thank goodness. And this must be Margaret. Eleanor Whitmore was nothing like Margaret had expected. She was tiny, probably not even 5 feet tall, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and bright blue eyes that sparkled with intelligence and kindness. When Thomas helped Margaret down from the wagon, Eleanor immediately stepped forward and took her hands. My dear, she said, studying Margaret's face with gentle attention, you have such lovely eyes. They're the color of sage-grass after a rain. Welcome to our home. Margaret felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. It had been so long since anyone had said something genuinely kind about her appearance. Eleanor's compliment felt like a gift, especially because it was clearly sincere rather than polite. Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore, Margaret managed to say. I hope I can be helpful here. Oh, please call me Eleanor, the older woman said with a dismissive wave. We're family now, after all. and I'm sure you'll be more than helpful. Thomas has told me wonderful things about you." Margaret shot a surprised glance at Thomas, who was unloading her trunk from the wagon. What wonderful things could he possibly have said? They had only met twice before today. Eleanor must have noticed her confusion because she laughed softly. "He told me you're honest and practical, that you're not afraid of hard work, and that you have a good head for numbers. Those are high compliments coming from my son, I assure you." As Thomas carried her belongings into the house, Eleanor linked arms with Margaret and gave her a tour of what would be her new home. The house was larger than it had appeared from outside, with a comfortable parlor, a spacious kitchen, and 3 bedrooms upstairs. Everything was clean and well organized. But Margaret could see places where a woman's touch was needed. Curtains that needed mending, windows that could use a thorough cleaning, and empty spaces on shelves that seemed to be waiting for personal touches. "I've tried to keep up with everything," Eleanor explained apologetically, "but I'm not as strong as I used to be. My hands shake too much for fine sewing now, and I can't reach the high places anymore for proper cleaning." "I'd be happy to help with all of that," Margaret said, already mentally making lists of tasks. "Back home, I manage most of the household duties." Eleanor's smile grew even brighter. "I knew Thomas had chosen well. You have such a capable air about you." That evening, as they sat down to dinner, Margaret experienced something she had never had before, being treated as an equal adult in a family conversation. Thomas asked her opinion about which bedroom she would prefer and whether she thought the parlor would be more comfortable with the furniture rearranged. Eleanor shared stories about the local families and asked Margaret about her interests and experiences. Nobody talked over her or dismissed her thoughts. The food was simple, but delicious, and Margaret found herself relaxing for the first time in months. The conversation flowed naturally, with Thomas sharing news from town and Eleanor talking about the letters she had received from friends. When Margaret mentioned that she enjoyed reading, both Thomas and Eleanor perked up with interest. "Thomas has quite a collection of books," Eleanor said proudly. "Show her the library, dear." After dinner, Thomas led Margaret to a room she hadn't seen during the afternoon tour. It was small but cozy, with built-in shelves covering 3 walls and a comfortable reading chair by the window. The books weren't fancy leather-bound volumes like the ones in wealthy homes, but they were well cared for and covered a surprising range of topics. There were novels and poetry collections, books about farming and animal husbandry, histories and biographies, and even a few books written by women authors. "Ruth never cared much for reading," Thomas said quietly, running his finger along the spine of a poetry collection. "She said books were a waste of time when there was real work to be done. But I've always found that books teach you things you can't learn any other way." Margaret pulled a volume of Shakespeare from the shelf and opened it carefully. The pages showed signs of being read many times, with notes written in the margins in Thomas's careful handwriting. "You've read all of these?" she asked, genuinely impressed. "Most of them. The winter evenings are long out here, and there's not always ranch work that can be done after dark." He paused, then added, "You're welcome to read any of them you'd like, or if there are books you particularly want, I can get them when I go to town." Margaret felt something inside her chest loosen, a tension she hadn't even realized she was carrying. In her father's house, her love of reading had been seen as a character flaw, something that made her less marriageable and less useful. Here, it was simply accepted as part of who she was. The next few days brought a routine that was completely different from anything Margaret had known. She woke early as she always had, but instead of dreading the day ahead, she found herself curious about what it would bring. Thomas showed her around the ranch, introducing her to the horses and explaining how everything worked. He was patient with her questions and never made her feel foolish for not knowing something. The horses, in particular, fascinated her. She had always been told that horses were dangerous and unpredictable, but Thomas's animals were calm and responsive. He taught her how to approach them safely, how to read their moods, and how to handle them with confidence rather than fear. "Animals can sense when you're afraid," Thomas explained as Margaret tentatively petted the nose of a gentle Mari named Daisy. "But they can also sense when you respect them. Treat them fairly, and they'll do the same for you. Margaret found herself thinking that the same philosophy seemed to apply to how Thomas treated people. He respected her intelligence, her opinions, and her capabilities, and in return, she found herself feeling more confident and capable than she ever had before. Eleanor, despite her frail health, became the mother figure Margaret had always wished for. She shared family recipes and stories, taught Margaret about the local plants and their uses, and listened with genuine interest when Margaret talked about her own experiences and dreams. For the first time in her life, Margaret felt like her thoughts and feelings mattered to someone. By the end of her first week at the ranch, Margaret realized something remarkable was happening. She was beginning to see herself differently. Instead of the unwanted, plain daughter who couldn't find a husband, she was starting to feel like a valuable partner in building something meaningful. Thomas and Eleanor didn't see her as a burden or a disappointment. They saw her as Margaret, a person worth knowing and caring about. 3 months had passed since Margaret's arrival at the Whitmore Ranch, and the changes in her daily life had been remarkable. Every morning, she woke to the sound of roosters crowing and the gentle lowing of cattle in the distance instead of her father's irritated voice calling for someone to start breakfast. The air smelled of grass and wildflowers instead of smoke and crowded streets. But the biggest change wasn't in her surroundings, it was in herself. Margaret had always been good with numbers, but back home, that skill had been seen as strange and unwomanly. Here, Thomas relied on her mathematical abilities completely. She kept track of cattle births and deaths, calculated feed costs and profit margins, and managed the ranch's financial records with a precision that impressed even the bank manager in town. When Thomas came home from selling cattle at market, he would sit with her at the kitchen table and go over every detail of the transaction, asking for her thoughts on pricing and future planning. "You've got a mind like a steel trap," Thomas told her one evening as they worked through the books together. "I don't know how I managed these records before you came. Everything makes so much more sense now." Margaret felt a warm glow of pride that was completely new to her. For the first time in her life, someone valued her intelligence and treated it as an asset rather than a flaw. Thomas never made her feel like she was overstepping her bounds or getting too involved in men's business. Instead, he seemed genuinely grateful for her help and often sought her advice on ranch decisions. The physical work of ranch life had been challenging at first, but Margaret found herself growing stronger every day. She learned to milk cows without getting kicked, to gather eggs from temperamental hens, and to help with the endless tasks that kept a ranch running smoothly. Her hands, once soft from a life of indoor work, developed calluses from handling ropes and tools. Her arms grew stronger from carrying feed buckets and water pails. Even her posture changed as she learned to carry herself with the confidence of someone who knew she was capable and needed. Eleanor had become the mother Margaret had always wished for. The older woman's health wasn't strong, but her spirit was bright and encouraging. She taught Margaret about medicinal plants that grew wild on the ranch, shared family recipes that had been passed down for generations, and told stories about Thomas's childhood that made Margaret understand her husband better. "He was always a thoughtful boy," Eleanor said one afternoon as they sat on the porch shelling peas. "Even as a child, he'd watch and listen before making decisions. His father used to worry that he was too quiet, but I knew he was just taking everything in, learning how the world worked." Margaret found herself opening up to Eleanor in ways she never had with her own mother. She shared her fears about not being good enough, her dreams of having children someday, and her amazement at how different life could be when people treated you with kindness and respect. "You know," Eleanor said thoughtfully when Thomas told me he was bringing home a wife, I was worried. His first marriage wasn't unhappy exactly, but Ruth never seemed to find her place here. She was always looking toward town, wishing she was somewhere else, but you look at this land like you see its possibilities." It was true. Margaret had fallen in love with the ranch in a way that surprised her. She loved the endless sky and the way the light changed throughout the day. She loved watching the cattle move across the pastures like slow-moving clouds. She even loved the challenges, the early mornings, the physical demands, the need to be resourceful and creative when problems arose, the transformation in Margaret's confidence, became especially clear when neighbors came to visit. The Whitmore Ranch wasn't isolated, and other ranching families would stop by regularly to share news, ask for help, or simply enjoy each other's company. At first, Margaret had been nervous about meeting these new people, worried they would judge her the way people had back home, but something amazing happened during these social visits. When Thomas introduced her as his wife, he did so with obvious pride and respect. He would mention her skill with the account books, or how quickly she had learned to handle the horses, or how much Eleanor enjoyed her company. His genuine admiration for her abilities made others see her differently too. Not everyone was immediately welcoming, of course. Some of the neighboring wives clearly expected Thomas to have married someone younger and prettier. Margaret overheard whispered comments about her plain appearance and advanced age. But instead of crushing her spirit the way such comments once had, Margaret found that she cared less about their opinions. She was too busy building a life she actually enjoyed to worry much about people who wanted to judge her for not being someone else. The turning point came during a community barn raising for a neighbor whose building had been damaged in a storm. Margaret had volunteered to help coordinate the food preparation for all the workers, using her organizational skills to make sure everything ran smoothly. When some of the other women started to question her methods, Thomas quietly but firmly supported her approach. "Margaret knows what she's doing," he said simply. "She's been managing our household accounts and ranch planning since she arrived, and everything runs better now than it ever has." His public confidence in her abilities silenced the criticism and made Margaret stand a little taller. She realized that having someone believe in you could change everything about how you saw yourself and how others saw you too. The evenings had become Margaret's favorite time of day. After the work was done and Eleanor had gone to bed, she and Thomas would often sit together in the small library, each reading their own book but sharing the comfortable quiet. Sometimes Thomas would read passages aloud that he found interesting, and Margaret would do the same. They discovered they both enjoyed poetry, though Thomas preferred the practical wisdom of folk poems while Margaret loved the romantic imagery of classical verses. "Listen to this," Margaret said one evening, reading from a collection of nature poetry. "The earth laughs and flowers, and every blade of grass is a poem waiting to be discovered." Thomas looked up from his farming journal with a smile. "That's beautiful. It reminds me of how you looked when you first saw the ranch. Like you were reading a poem written in the landscape." These moments of shared appreciation and understanding were building something between them that Margaret had never expected. Their marriage had begun as a practical arrangement, but it was slowly becoming something deeper. Thomas's consistent kindness and respect were teaching Margaret that she was worthy of care and attention. Her competence and gentle nature were showing Thomas that a true partnership could be more fulfilling than he had ever imagined. Margaret began to take pride in her appearance for the first time, not because she had become conventionally beautiful, but because she felt valued and appreciated. The outdoor work had given her a healthy glow, and the regular meals had filled out her too thin frame. More importantly, the confidence she was gaining showed in the way she carried herself and spoke to others. When she looked in the mirror now, she didn't see the plain, unwanted daughter her father had been ashamed of. She saw a capable ranch wife, a valued partner, and a woman who was finally discovering her own worth. The transformation wasn't magical or sudden. It was the natural result of being treated with respect and given the chance to flourish in the right environment. The ranch was changing too, improving under Margaret's influence and organization. The house was cleaner and more welcoming, the records were perfectly maintained, and the whole operation ran more efficiently. Thomas often marveled at how much better everything functioned with Margaret as his partner, and Margaret felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that her contributions were making a real difference in their shared life. The spring calving season arrived with all the challenges and excitement that Margaret had heard about but never experienced. For weeks, she and Thomas barely slept, taking turns checking on the pregnant cows and making sure everything went smoothly. Margaret had never imagined she would be comfortable around birth and blood. but she found herself fascinated by the miracle of new life and surprisingly calm in emergency situations. It was during one of these long nights that everything changed between her and Thomas. They had been called out to the barn at 2 in the morning because Rosie, one of their best breeding cows, was having difficulty with her delivery. The calf was positioned wrong, and without help, both mother and baby could die. Margaret held the lantern steady while Thomas worked, his sleeves rolled up and his face tight with concentration. She could see how much this meant to him. Every animal on the ranch represented months of careful planning and financial investment, but more than that, he genuinely cared about their welfare. "The calf's front legs are tangled," Thomas said, his voice tense. "I need to try to turn it, but I can't see properly with just one hand free." Without being asked, Margaret set down the lantern and moved closer. "Tell me what to do." For the next hour, they worked together with a coordination that surprised them both. Margaret anticipated what Thomas needed before he asked, held things steady when he needed both hands free, and stayed calm even when the situation looked hopeless. When the calf finally slipped free and took its first shaky breath, both Margaret and Thomas were covered in sweat and exhaustion, but their faces were glowing with triumph. "We did it," Thomas said, watching the newborn calf struggle to its feet. "Margaret, I couldn't have managed this without you. You were incredible." Something in his voice made Margaret look up at him. In the dim light of the barn, with straw in his hair and his shirt dirty from the work, Thomas was looking at her with an expression she had never seen before. It wasn't just gratitude or respect, it was something deeper, warmer, and more personal. "You're amazing," he said quietly. "The way you handled that, the way you handle everything. I don't know what I did to deserve someone like you." Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. "Thomas, I know this wasn't a love match when we married," he continued, stepping closer to her. "I know your father was desperate to find you a husband, and I needed a practical wife. But Margaret, somewhere along the way, this became something different for me. You've become someone different to me." The words hung in the air between them, full of possibility and fear. Margaret had been so focused on building a new life and finding her place at the ranch that she hadn't allowed herself to hope for romantic love. But now, standing in the barn with the sound of new life around them, she realized that her feelings for Thomas had been growing too. "I used to think love was just something that happened to other people," Margaret said softly. "My sisters, with their pretty faces and charming ways. I thought I wasn't the kind of person who got to have that." Thomas reached out and gently touched her cheek, his rough rancher's hand incredibly gentle against her skin. "You're exactly the kind of person who deserves love. You're kind and smart and strong, and you make everything better just by being here. I should have told you sooner, but I was afraid you might not feel the same way." Margaret leaned into his touch, feeling tears of happiness threatening to spill over. "I do feel the same way. I think I have for a while now, but I was scared to believe it was real." When Thomas kissed her for the first time, it wasn't like the dramatic romantic scenes Margaret had read about in books. It was gentle and real and full of the kind of deep affection that grows between two people who truly know and appreciate each other. Standing there in the barn, surrounded by hay and the smell of animals, Margaret felt more beautiful and beloved than any princess in any fairy tale. The change in their relationship was subtle but profound. They had always been partners in running the ranch, but now they were partners in everything. The small gestures of daily life took on new meaning. Thomas bringing Margaret coffee in the morning, Margaret mending his work shirts with extra care, the way they moved around each other in the kitchen with an awareness that was both comfortable and electric. Eleanor noticed the change immediately and couldn't have been more delighted. "I've been watching you two dance around each other for months," she said to Margaret with a knowing smile. "I was beginning to wonder if I'd have to lock you in the barn together to make you realize what was obvious to everyone else." As spring turned to summer, Margaret discovered that being loved for who she really was felt completely different from anything she had imagined. Thomas never tried to change her or make her into someone else. He loved her quick mind, her dry sense of humor, and even her stubborn streak when she felt strongly about something. He was proud of her accomplishments and supported her ideas. Whether she wanted to try a new recipe or reorganize the barn for better efficiency. The transformation in Margaret was remarkable, but it wasn't about becoming beautiful in the conventional sense. Instead, she had discovered a confidence and inner light that made her attractive in a way that had nothing to do with perfect features or fashionable clothes. When they went to town together, people noticed how Thomas looked at his wife with obvious pride and affection, and how Margaret carried herself with the assurance of a woman who knew she was valued. News of their happiness eventually reached Margaret's family back home. Helena wrote to say that she had heard from mutual acquaintances about Margaret's successful marriage to a prosperous rancher. The letter was full of surprise and barely concealed curiosity about how the plain sister had managed to find such a good match. Margaret wrote back with genuine warmth, describing her new life without boasting or bitterness. She told her sisters about the beauty of the ranch, Eleanor's kindness, and Thomas's character. She didn't mention that she had found the kind of love they had all assumed was beyond her reach. That would have seemed too much like gloating. And Margaret had grown beyond the need to prove anything to people who had never understood her worth. As autumn arrived, Margaret realized she was expecting their first child. The news filled her with a mixture of joy and nervous excitement. Thomas was overjoyed, and Eleanor began immediately planning all the things she would teach her future grandchild. "This baby will be so lucky," Eleanor said, sitting with Margaret on the porch as they watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "To grow up here with parents who love each other and understand what really matters in life." Margaret placed her hand on her still flat stomach and smiled. "I want to raise children who judge people by their character, not their appearance. Who understand that real beauty comes from kindness and strength and the courage to be yourself." That winter, as snow covered the ranch and the three of them spent long evenings by the fire, Margaret often thought about the girl she used to be. The lonely, plain daughter who had been so convinced of her own unworthiness seemed like a different person entirely. That girl couldn't have imagined this life, a loving husband who valued her mind and heart, a mother-in-law who cherished her like a daughter, and a home where she felt truly needed and appreciated. Eleanor lived to see the birth of Margaret's first child, a daughter they named Grace, meaning blessing. As Margaret held her baby for the first time, with Thomas beside her and Eleanor offering tearful congratulations, she realized that her story had become everything she had never dared to dream. She wasn't the prettiest or most charming woman in the world, but she was exactly the right woman for this life, this man, and this moment. The little girl who had once been called the ugliest Fletcher daughter had become a beloved wife, a cherished daughter-in-law, and now a proud mother. She had learned that real love doesn't depend on perfect features or fashionable clothes. It grows between people who see and appreciate each other's true selves, and who choose to build something beautiful together.